And that, my friends, is how America was made great once again. Breaking at this hour, Jimmy Sengenberger is currently at the crossroads of politics and economics. Radio broadcaster master, now the celeb on the web. He's the smarty of the party. He's in cahoots with the grassroots. Jimmy at the Crossroads brings you thought-provoking commentary, hard-hitting interviews, original satire, and the best bumper music known to man. Jimmy at the Crossroads!
Gonna talk money, gonna talk politics. Great for all generations. Oh, what a great mix, I said. Gonna talk money, gonna talk politics. Great for all generations. Oh, what a great mix. I got Jimmy at the Crossroads, making sense out of nonsense. People want answers, they want to understand. They come to the crossroads and Jimmy gives them the plan. I said, gonna talk money, gonna talk politics. Great for all generations, oh what a great mix. I got Jimmy at the crossroads, making sense out of nonsense. Come on, Jimmy, what you got?
Hello, my friends, and welcome to a free-to-choose Friday edition of Jimmy at the Crossroads. I am Jimmy Sengenberger, your host for the program, coming to you in partnership with the Washington Examiner, and it is such a pleasure and a privilege to be with you today, as it is every day. Doing our level best to make sense out of nonsense and bring engaging, intelligent talk, Sang style. So great to be with you. Gosh, Friday already. Boy, does time fly. Thanks for joining us, being a part of the program. Want to join into the festivities? You can tweet at me 24/7, 365 at Sang Center. That's Sang with an E, not an A, Center on Twitter. You can also go ahead and email me via the websites jimmysengenberger.com. Remember, there's no A, there's no I, there's no U in Sengenberger. It's all E's all the time, and once you know that, Sengenberger is easy. You can also log on to jimmyatthecrossroads.com, our show website. Contact me that way. My email address is on the contact page there. Be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel if you have not done so already. YouTube.com/Jimmy at the Crossroads, and on Facebook, the Jimmy Sengenberger Media Personality page is the place to go. Of course, follow our friends and partners at the Washington Examiner on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and at WashingtonExaminer.com. Great show today. We're going to be separating it into just two segments as we delve in to a very important topic: the need to beware regulation of big tech, which is now a big topic of conversation due to an executive order by President Trump yesterday. This is Free to Choose Friday. We do it in part because we are free to think, free to act, and free to choose, and we ought to be as human beings, but also to honor the late, great Milton Friedman, who back about 1980 did a series called Free to Choose based on his book of the same name, and here's how he would open those episodes. Nathan Matoush just loves that intro, our producer extraordinaire working the Matoush magic, because it's so, what was it, I think, retro, is a word that he's used. So gotta love the great late Milton Friedman. Today we are going to focus, as I mentioned, on regulating big tech platforms, particularly social media. Now, we need to be cautious about this for reasons we will get to momentarily. Today, we will talk from the legal angle with Professor of Law at the UCLA School of Law, Eugene Volokh, who is also the purveyor of the highly trafficked legal blog, The Volok Conspiracy. He will join us today to delve into the legal side of big tech regulation and this Section 230 that President Trump wants to amend regulations under. We will also talk with Matthew Feeney, who's with the Cato Institute, where he is the director of their Project on Emerging Technologies, about we're going to talk with Professor Volok about the legal side of things, and then we'll talk with Matthew Feeney about the arguments against big tech regulation, as well as the arguments for big tech regulation and how we might see it handled. Now, Milton Friedman, the great late economist, was not really around for very long during the internet. He died in 2006. But he was around for some of the era of the internet, certainly the budding era of the internet. And he did an interview with the National Taxpayers Union in 1999 that was very interesting because he did talk a little bit about internet. He did talk a little bit about technology and regulation and antitrust. And that's something I want to play a clip of here in Cut 2, where Milton Friedman talks a little bit about the idea of monopolies and antitrust, which are very relevant today because people are often looking at these tech platforms and saying, hey, you guys are monopolies and you need to be regulated using antitrust statutes. That's one approach that some people are suggesting. Here's Milton Friedman, 1999, talking a little bit about that in Cut 2.
And the issue of antitrust is of long standing. The basic antitrust legislation was enacted in 1890. And we've had many ups and downs in its applications. The law is supposed to promote competition, but on the whole, it probably does more to promote monopoly than it does competition. Moreover, it involves a very inefficient interference by the government into the dynamics of the economy. Monopoly is a real problem, but it tends to be transitory, to be very short-lived in most cases. The only ways in which monopoly can last is when it has government backing.
Which is so true. You look at AT&T, for example. A long-running monopoly specifically because the government said, hey, you guys could be a monopoly. Very few instances exist of a long-running monopoly. You can look, for example, tech-wise, at MySpace. MySpace was completely replaced by Facebook. Nobody uses MySpace now. In fact, MySpace is an entirely different website than it was back in the day when it was actually being used as the first real social media platform. Things change with technology and its growth. Things change with cultural evolutions. Sure, Facebook and Twitter have been dominant for quite some time now, but that doesn't mean that they're going to continue to be the dominating platforms. Now, I want to play one more clip before we welcome our first guest onto the show. This is Cut 3. Again, Milton Friedman, in 1999, speaking to the National Taxpayers Union and expressing his concern about Silicon Valley, at that time starting to welcome government involvement in tech platforms, in tech industries, in a way that it hadn't been, because the internet in particular was more of a freewheeling opportunity for people at that time. Now today, his words resonate even more.
Business in general has something of a suicidal instinct. It often proposes laws in its own self-interest which destroy the underlying basis of the whole private enterprise system. I believe that is what has been happening recently in the computer industry. Silicon Valley is suicidal in calling government in to mediate in its the disputes among some of the big companies in the area and Microsoft. The end result will be that an industry that up to now has been able to proceed at a marvelous pace with little or no government regulation. It has been a wonderful example of the efficiencies of a strictly free private market. That industry is now going to have government all over it. It's going to spend in legal fees over the next 10 or 20 years, money which society would benefit from much more if it were spent in the kind of research and development that has brought us the many miracles in the area of internet, in the area of home computers, industry computers, and all the rest.
His words resonate even more today than they did 21 years ago when Milton Friedman made those remarks cautioning everybody about big tech companies embracing government involvement. We need to keep that in mind as we go about our discussion today. Here on this Free to Choose Friday edition of Jimmy at the Crossroads, we want to delve into some of the legal issues as well as the practical issues of regulating big tech and why we need to beware of government intrusion in that space. And I want to start today by talking about the legal dynamics, both about President Trump's executive order yesterday, but also the broader questions about regulating social media platforms and other big tech companies, as we see a growing discussion about the supposed need to do just that. From the legal standpoint, I am pleased to be welcomed by Eugene Volokh, who teaches First Amendment law in a First Amendment amicus brief clinic at UCLA School of Law, where he's also often taught copyright law, criminal law, tort law, and a seminar on firearms regulation policy. He's also the founder, purveyor, editor of The Volok Conspiracy, a highly trafficked legal blog, one of the leading legal blogs out there today. Professor Eugene Volokh joins us here on this Free to Choose Friday edition of Jimmy at the Crossroads. Professor, welcome to the show. It's such a pleasure to have you on today.
Likewise. Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you for taking the time. So I want to jump in first before we get to the arguments for or against the regulation of big tech, the idea of President Trump's social media executive order yesterday, to the legal basis for where we're at right now, because there's something called Section 230, which President Trump referenced yesterday. We hear that talked about quite a bit, that protects companies like Facebook and Twitter from legal liability for things that are posted on their platforms and what have you. Talk to us a little bit about the lay of the land for regulation of so-called big tech companies right now, Section 230 and otherwise.
Sure. So we talk about regulation, and we're often skeptical about it. I certainly am often skeptical about it. But of course, the entire legal system, including traditional rules about libel, invasion of privacy, breach of contract, and the like, are all about a form of regulation. So the question is almost never whether to have regulation at all. It's what kind of regulation. So traditionally, for example, how have newspapers been regulated? Because of the freedom of the press, we don't have requirements that you persuade the government that it's okay to have you publish a newspaper, but you are subject to the threat of liability for defamation, for invasion of privacy, for a few other torts, based on what you publish in your newspaper. If, for example, it's false and damages a person's reputation, you could be sued. And that has historically been true with regard to things that you publish that you didn't write. So a letter to the editor, if that's libelous, you, the newspaper publisher, can be sued for that too. So that's one form of regulation, traditionally for newspapers, for other publishers. Now, what about bookstores? Long before the internet, remember, there were these things called bookstores. I don't mean the real bookstores like Amazon.com, where you just push a button and something gets downloaded. You had to go there and look at the shelves, very backward. But there it was. They were big back in the day. What happened if I thought that a book in a bookstore libeled me? In that case, I couldn't just sue the bookstore because nobody expected bookstore owners to have read every word in the book that they carry, the way that newspaper editors were supposed to read everything that they publish. So they were subject to liability as distributors. So they couldn't be sued unless I put them on notice that this was defamatory and explained why that's so. Then they could be sued if they kept it on the shelves. What about a phone company? What if somebody was libeling me through the phone company? Those were treated, one might say, as platforms. They were completely immune from liability. So one question is, what regulatory scheme should there be for internet services? So one example, what about for email services? There was a New York decision in 1999 that said, well, email services are just like phone companies in this respect. You can't hold them liable. But what about something like Facebook, YouTube, and the like? And in Section 230, Congress decided to deregulate those in considerable measure, to say they're going to be regulated like phone companies rather than like, say, bookstores or like newspapers. That was the law. And what that means is if somebody libels me online, on Facebook, let's say, I can sue the person, although maybe I won't get any money from the person. Maybe I can't even track down the person, but I can't sue Facebook.
So what's so fascinating about this is kind of sort of the evolution over time of regulation in this space, because it is new technology in compared to where things were at before, and it's unique. It does seem like social media is unique because what you've got with a platform like Facebook and Twitter, Professor Volok, is this notion that it's public, that you're sharing information and ideas and thoughts and opinions in a public venue, in a public platform, but it's also privately owned and operated. So it's not quite the same as, say, an email or a telephone call or text message, correct?
So that's right, although note, so for example, there was an old telephone case which involved somebody who had on their answering machine an outgoing message, which was libeling someone. So this was a way of using the telephone system to speak publicly. Likewise, I am still on several email lists with hundreds of users where we talk to each other. Or sometimes the dean of the law school sends messages by email to the 1,000+ students in law school. So there is something of a matter of degree, and something perhaps as a matter of kind, a difference in kind between Facebook and email. But in practice, given that most people don't have their Facebook pages actually read by millions of people, the communications on one's Facebook page may not be that different from communication on email discussions.
Now let's go to what we've seen this week. This has been fascinating. Let's put up pick one. This is a tweet that President Trump put out earlier this week about mail-in ballots, where he basically was saying this is a recipe for fraud. And in California, you have ballots going out to people who are not supposed to be registered voters. And then Twitter added this little note, get the facts about mail-in ballots. That prompted President Trump to push back very vocally. Well, then, yesterday, the president put out this tweet in pick two, where he said, and you can notice two different things in this tweet, that one, the first tweet is there in full. The second tweet says this tweet violated the Twitter rules about glorifying violence. However, Twitter has determined that it may be in the public's interest for the tweet to remain accessible, and you can view it, and you can see what he said in a statement that ended, any difficulty and we will assume control, but when the looting starts, the shooting starts. Thank you. So that's President Trump being censored by Twitter. And after that happened, and the mail-in ballots happened, that tweet happened, and Twitter had put up that fact-check notice, the president decided to go forward and put forward this social media executive order yesterday. We'll get to the executive order in a moment, but what do you make about the president of the United States being fact-checked by Twitter on that platform and also being censored by Twitter on that platform?
Censored. They didn't block his tweet. Now, it may be that if it wasn't President Trump, they would have blocked this tweet, and then I think we could fault Twitter for that. What they did was they spoke, right? He said something, they said something in response. That's free speech. That's the marketplace of ideas, I think, actually working. Now, his statement about mail-in ballots was actually an opinion. It's a judgment about whether mail-in ballots lead to a large amount of fraud. As best I'm not an expert on this. As best I can tell, there is some fraud with mail-in ballots. Apparently not a vast amount, but it's a question of debate. This isn't a matter of kind of proven fact about some specific specific thing that may have happened in the past. This is a matter of judgment about how safe or dangerous mail-in ballots are. About the looting starts, the shooting starts, that's also a matter of opinion. In some measure, it's a matter of fact. It is true when people loot, some people may shoot at them. Sometimes there'll be fellow looters. Sometimes it will be people defending themselves. Sometimes it'll be police officers. So actually, I think that President Trump was quite accurate in that. I don't think he was glorifying violence. To the extent he was threatening violence in the sense that all law threatens violence, right? If you do this, you'll be arrested. An arrest is a violent act. No justice, no peace is something similar. So this is a matter of his opinions and then Twitter responding with its opinions. I think the Twitter's opinion that this is glorifying violence, I think, is an unsound opinion. But we're having this debate about it. There's no censorship there. Now, there is perhaps blocking some of the tweets, but not here.
Well, but here's the thing, though, about the way in which Twitter conducted its responses. Let's go to the first tweet, for example, where the president put up his comments and remarks of his opinion on mail-in ballots. And then Twitter responds by saying, get the facts about mail-in ballots. That's not just responding with counter speech necessarily. One could make the argument that what Twitter's doing is using its power as the platform leader to say, this guy is factually wrong. Come see our list of supposed facts on this. And so it's not necessarily an equal weight conversation of one speech responding to another speech. At least that's where one could argue.
Well, so who says that the First Amendment only protects equal weight conversations? Most conversations are not equal weight conversations. You have more ability to speak than some person somewhere out there. If you get a caller in, I don't know if you have callers on your show, but if you get a caller in, it's not an equal weight conversation between you and the caller. You can cut off the caller can't cut off you, right?
I could cut off you right now.
You could. I hope you don't, because I'm enjoying this conversation.
Don't worry, me too.
But it need not be an equal weight conversation. And in fact, actually, President Trump is not someone who lacks weight, and Twitter doesn't. I do think when they say get the facts, they're actually spinning the facts too. I think what they mean by facts is our judgment about the best state of expert opinion. And you can fault them for that. We are faulting them for that. But this is the way free speech operates. And historically, of course, it may not have been Twitter. It may have been the New York Times. It may have been CNN, who were very powerful and who still are very powerful. So that doesn't bother me, and I don't think it should bother us, except insofar as you could say Twitter is wrong in these things or Twitter is biased in the ways it does this. Sure, criticize them for that, but it's not censorship. On the other hand, sometimes Twitter and Facebook do block actual things. And the suggestion, as I understood it, in Twitter's message about when the looting starts, the shooting starts, is that they're only allowing it through because it's President Trump and it's important to know what he's saying. That is something that I think is bad for debate. I do think it's part of Twitter's property rights as a property owner. I don't think anybody has. Certainly people don't have a First Amendment right to use private property like Twitter, but I don't think it's good for debate that Twitter would shut off statements like, by ordinary people, when the looting starts, the shooting starts.
Again, we're talking with UCLA School of Law professor Eugene Volokh, also the purveyor of the highly trafficked, highly regarded Volok Conspiracy Legal blog. I want to play a couple of clips of President Trump and get your reaction from the legal standpoint. In Cut 8 yesterday, the president listed out some of his grievances against social media platforms, and I'd love to get your reaction to this. So let's go to Cut 8. This is President Trump yesterday again announcing his social media executive orders.
They've had unchecked power to censor, restrict, edit, shape, hide, alter virtually any form of communication between private citizens or large public audiences. There's no precedent in American history for so small a number of corporations to control so large a sphere of human interaction, and that includes individual people controlling vast amounts of territory, and we can't allow that to happen, especially when they go about doing what they're doing, because they're doing things incorrectly. They have points of view, and if we go by that, it's actually amazing that there was a success in 2016, but we can't let this continue to happen. It's very, very unfair.
So I want to get your reaction, Professor Volokh, to President Trump's comments there in terms of making the case for why some change in the dynamics of social media is appropriate, but for you, from the legal standpoint.
Well, so I think he's making a criticism that it traditionally had been made from the left, but maybe the left is right on this, maybe not, of private power. That when private entities have a great deal of control over what is said, that is bad for democracy. That's a standard criticism and plausible, although again, maybe government attempts to control that private power are even worse for democracy. Historically, that's been said about newspapers, because even though newspapers never had the reach of Twitter and Facebook, generally speaking, never had the market share, within particular cities they may have. There were a lot of cities, there were one newspaper towns where basically the newspaper got to control a great deal of the debate. And people thought that maybe unfairly, and maybe in ways that influenced elections. Newspapers were trying to influence elections in many ways. So that's his criticism. Now, what can he do about this? Well, remember, he's the president. He's not the Congress. He doesn't make the laws. Section 230 is out there, and Section 230 says that Twitter, Facebook, and the like are entitled to be free from liability for things that their users post, even if they edit, even if they exclude certain things or delete certain things. That was a deliberate choice by Congress. Congress wanted that because they wanted these services to protect users from offensive material and the like. So that's the law. Also, the law is there is no federal statute that requires viewpoint neutrality by platforms. So President Trump can't change Section 230. President Trump can't enact this new law. Now, in this order, he does a few things. He asks Department of Commerce to ask the Federal Communications Commission to interpret Section 230 to kind of push the platforms towards viewpoint neutrality. I don't think that'll happen. I'm not sure FCC even has jurisdiction over these issues. But even if it does, I doubt that the FCC will actually interpret Section 230 as limiting platforms' power to edit, because Section 230 is all about giving platform power to edit. Another thing that he says is that federal agencies should study where they spend federal advertising dollars, and if they're doing it on platforms that discriminate based on viewpoint, and should discuss whether they could move that advertising to other places. That's something he might be able to do by executive order. It'll take a while, but beyond that, I'm not sure that federal government has that many advertising dollars it's spending on Facebook and Twitter that you can use as leverage this way. And the other factor that's important is Facebook and Twitter routinely engage in viewpoint discrimination that people like. Most people like. And that is they deliberately try to block and delete pro-terrorist propaganda. And not just constitutionally unprotected. A lot of pro-terrorist propaganda is constitutionally protected, even though it's evil, but it's protected. So if you really want to if you really want to pressure these platforms to be viewpoint neutral, you'd have to give up that function, which, as I understand it, administrations of both parties have long actually supported, and the public generally supports. So it's not clear to me that really viewpoint neutrality is something that's going to be politically feasible to insist on. But in any case, President Trump can't really do that. It would take a congressional act to try to do that. Even then, it may be that the platforms have a First Amendment right to edit this way. They certainly have a First Amendment right to flag things as supposedly false, but it's an interesting question whether they have a First Amendment right to block things they don't like. It's an interesting question, but at least Congress could, in principle, enact such a viewpoint neutrality common carrier type statute for platforms like for telephone companies or some cable operators or the like, but President Trump can't do that.
Well, here's one of the things that's deeply concerning to me from a philosophical level about this kind of approach that President Trump is wanting to take, Professor Eugene Volokh, and that is that when we have the government get involved in regulating speech aspects of these social media companies, that could lead to the federal government starting to make determinations itself about censoring speech or not censoring certain types of speech, which then gets into a more difficult situation in terms of the First Amendment. It actually starts to kick in, I think, if there is no longer the ability for these social media companies to make their own determinations as to what should or should not be blocked. If you have the federal government getting involved, then I think that opens up a dangerous can of worms from a constitutional and individual liberty standpoint.
Well, it's complicated. The precedents are not completely clear. So let's assume that Congress, and again, it can't be the president, it has to be Congress. Congress is who makes the laws. Let's assume that Congress says platforms, when it comes to deciding whether to host your web page or host your Facebook page or not, must be viewpoint neutral, or perhaps even must be content neutral. They have to be like the phone company, which can't just say, well, we think you're a Nazi or we think you're a communist, so we're just going to cut off your phone service. So let's assume Congress enacts that kind of law. I'm not sure that law will be a step towards the government then deciding which speech to allow and which not to allow. On its face, the law and the practical application will say these private entities have to allow all speech, at least maybe setting aside constitutionally unprotected speech like true threats of violence. So that's the so I don't think it would be somehow inherently bad because it allows government censorship power. But the interesting question is, to what extent can the companies say we're like newspapers who have the right to decide we want to not publish some of that? The Supreme Court held in 1974 that a law mandating that newspapers publish responses to criticism of candidates, that was unconstitutional because it interfered with their editorial discretion. So Twitter, Facebook, and such may say, well, we should be like newspapers. But in 1994, the Supreme Court said in a case called Turner Broadcasting v. FCC that it was okay for the government to say cable system operators have to carry cable channels, have to carry broadcast channels as cable channels, even if they don't want to. And that didn't interfere with editorial discretion because as cable operators, they don't have the same rights to editorial discretion. And the Supreme Court upheld that by a 5-4 vote. So the question, the legal question would be whether these platforms are more like newspapers, again, not as to their own speech, but as to decisions about whom to include or exclude, or more like cable operators. But again, that only really comes up once you have this kind of common carrier or viewpoint neutrality mandate, and it takes congressional action, not just an executive order to do that.
What do you make, Professor Volok, in just a few minutes left with you, appreciate your time today here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. What do you make of the argument that these tech platforms are monopolies in effect, and therefore they should be regulated as such because they are so big, they are so powerful, they are so intrusive, so we should either break them up or we should treat them as utilities or take other steps regulatory-wise to address this notion that they are monopolies and thereby protect the individuals who use these platforms or are customers of different big tech companies?
Well, I'm not an expert on monopoly law or monopoly policy. As it happens, actually, the other Professor Volok, my brother, who teaches at Emory, is. But
Maybe
I'm not.
Get a dual Volok conversation then about that. That would be fun.
There you go.
Go on.
I can't speak with great confidence to this. My understanding is that there's nothing by way of illegal monopoly about Facebook or Twitter and the like. It's not like they deliberately monopolized the markets in particular ways. They just happened to create a service that a lot of people want to use. And because of these so-called network effects, because a service is more valuable to users if it has a lot of users, it tends to snowball and become very, very powerful. So the real question here isn't of technical details of antitrust law, but more in a sense of political theory and political practice, which is whether you think that once a company gets so big and so powerful that it can help sway elections in a very major way. I mean, all companies may in some measure, but in a major way, that's something that's bad for democracy, and there should be more democratic control, maybe not to say, well, you have to say this rather than that, but perhaps to make sure that they don't exclude certain voices and the like. That's a very interesting and difficult question. And you could say, no, private property is the really important thing, and if they're using their private property, they should be free to do that. You could say, well, no, making sure that there isn't undue control, undue power, private or public, is the important thing. You could say, in theory, it's okay to regulate, but in practice, they're actually not that influential, although I suspect they probably are. Or you could say, it's in theory maybe okay to regulate them, but in practice, we think the government will do more harm than good, as it does in a lot of situations where it tries to regulate. So these are interesting questions. I don't think the answer is obviously one thing or the other. I think this is a reasonable matter in which people could dispute. But again, very little authority here for the president as opposed to for the Congress.
Final question for you, Professor Volok. When it comes to the circumstances of the law, it seems to me that when people are concerned about that say a Twitter or Facebook is not applying their terms of service and their rules consistently. Say they are blocking certain speech versus other speech, and you can make the argument potentially that comparatively they are on the same plane, and you should block both if you're going to block the one, or you should block neither. I guess what I'm getting at is the court system. Is that the way to settle these sorts of disputes? If you think that Facebook or Twitter or YouTube is inconsistently applying the rules, that maybe that's the vehicle to do it, as opposed to some sort of a new regulatory regime where you have bureaucrats getting involved, or something along the lines of what President Trump is suggesting. Could that be the ticket?
Well, so under current law, it's just not illegal for them to be unfair in this way. Just like the New York Times may say, the news that's fit to print. But people say, well, wait a minute, why are you not printing that and printing this? Well, they may say they're objective, but they're human beings. Human beings are never perfectly objective when they're applying vague editorial standards. And there may be some discrimination there. That's not illegal. In fact, for the New York Times, it's clearly their First Amendment right. So under current law, there's just nothing wrong with Twitter doing that. Nothing illegal about Twitter being biased if it is biased. Now the question is, what if there is a law enacted? Who should enforce it? And yes, I think that having it be done through some executive branch employees, some administrative judges in some department, I don't think that would be constitutional. I don't think that would be wise. I think it would have to be done through the court system, which has important protections for its independence, which has juries as an option. For all the faults that juries have, that's the way we have our system operating, and that it's something that would need to be done through the court system, with all the inefficiencies and expenses and delays that the court system has. Now, of course, there's one other option, which is to have a statute that requires transparency, that requires Twitter to at least publish all of its decisions. Twitter is an example here, anybody else. Publish all of its decisions. It can't then be sued for a decision, but it has to explain what it's doing, and it has to do it truthfully. Maybe it could be sued if there's real evidence that it's untruthful, although that would have posed problems. And then the rest of us can at least see and can at least know what's happening. That's possible. Again, though, that would require a totally new statute.
Sure. Well, we have seen some different social media lawsuits that have not been successful for those trying to challenge, say, Twitter. For example, there's a Prager University case in that regard that have not necessarily been so successful in making sorts of arguments along those lines. But my view would be, if you could set up a system where the courts can suss it out, I agree with you that it's better than, say, a bureaucrat at the FCC or some other government agency making those sorts of determinations. Professor Eugene Volokh of the UCLA School of Law, thanks so much for taking your time today to join us. I really appreciate the conversation.
Thanks so much for having me. I very much enjoyed it.
Thank you. Same here. Again, Professor Eugene Volokh of the UCLA School of Law. Check out his blog at reason.com. The Volokh Conspiracy. We had Professor Ilya Soman on a couple days ago. Professor Soman is one of the bloggers at the Volokh Conspiracy. He's a contributor there. Great place to go for interesting legal analysis. Appreciate the conversation with Eugene Volokh. When we come back in just a matter of moments here on Jimmy at the Crossroads, we will be joined by Matthew Feeney, who's with the Cato Institute. We're going to delve into not so much the legal side of this issue, but we're really going to delve into the arguments for and against some of the government regulation and some of the steps that President Trump is moving forward with in terms of his executive order issued yesterday. So keep it right here. You're watching Jimmy at the Crossroads. I'm Jimmy Sengenberger, coming in partnership with the Washington Examiner.
America's politics are crazy. The culture is in flux. That's why we work hard to help you keep up.
More politics, more culture, and more access.
We focus on the biggest stories of the day with some of the biggest names in politics and punditry.
Go to our website, WashingtonExaminer.com. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Hey,
Hey, this is Frankie.
Hey, and I'm Angelo. We're the owners of F&A Pizzeria. If you're looking for the best pizza in town, remember us, F&A.
Hey, we got the best crust.
F&A.
We got the best cheese.
F&A.
We got the best sauce.
F&A, man.
Put it all together, what do you got?
F&A.
Yeah, you got that right. F&A.
F&A Pizza on the corner of Hill Ya Avenue and Dam Straight Street.
We all have rules we have to follow. But what if you could have a direct hand in helping to write the rules that would impact your life or your business? I'm Jimmy Sengenberger, and let's talk about exactly that. There's a lot of talk these days about the Trump administration's efforts to deregulate the American economy. If you think about it, though, deregulation is actually a great thing because it unleashes the unlimited potential of each and every individual. But in a lot of cases, you actually find folks advocating for more regulation, and frequently those people are the ones who will benefit most from the regulation. Such as big businesses like Facebook or General Motors that, if you put in more regulation, would be able to cut out the competition or directly benefit them. For example, putting up higher barriers to entry so that next small business, the next Mark Zuckerberg, won't really be able to get in on some of the action, some of the incredible opportunities. For example, last year we had the data privacy scandals for Facebook. Well, Mark Zuckerberg, CEO of Facebook, went before Congress and testified before a Senate committee.
I think the real question, as the internet becomes more important in people's lives, is what is the right regulation, not whether there should be or not.
But you as a company welcome regulation?
I think if it's the right regulation, then yes.
You think the Europeans have it right? So would you work with us in terms of what regulations you think are necessary in your industry?
Absolutely.
Okay. Would you submit to us some proposed regulations?
Yes, and I'll have my team follow up with you so that way we can have this discussion across the different categories where I think that this discussion needs to happen.
Look forward to it.
Now, what did you notice in this video? You had CEO Mark Zuckerberg say that he supports the right regulation, and a United States senator actually asked him to provide some sample regulations to potentially help write the regulations. Big businesses tend to support more regulation because it hurts their upstart competitors, say the next Mark Zuckerberg. That's why General Motors CEO Mary Barra has been advocating for a brand new effort to regulate in advance of the interests of battery-powered cars, which makes perfect sense because Mary Barra has actually begun moving forward with GM toward an electric-only future. So what you have here are big businesses having seats at the table day in and day out to help increase regulations to the disadvantage of smaller competitors. That's a case for less regulation, not more. And it's a message we can get across to millennials today, who are the most innovative generation, perhaps in history. That is a message we need to get across as well. So let's boldly proclaim it.
Welcome back to the Crossroads, ladies and gentlemen. Let's welcome back the host of Jimmy at the Crossroads, Mr. Sang Style, Jimmy Sengenberger.
Coming back on a free-to-choose Friday edition of Jimmy at the Crossroads, I am Jimmy Sengenberger. Such a pleasure and a privilege to be with you today. Free to Choose Friday in partnership with the Washington Examiner. If you have not done so already, please do subscribe to the YouTube channel, youtube.com/Jimmy at the Crossroads. Also, feel free to tweet at me. Certainly follow me on Twitter at Sang Center. That's Sang with an E and not an A, Center on Twitter. And also follow our partners at the Washington Examiner online as well, including on the website, WashingtonExaminer.com. So during the video clips that we played just a moment ago, you saw a commentary I made on Facebook. And the testimony that had been provided before the United States Congress in 2018 by Facebook CEO and co-founder Mark Zuckerberg. I want to play a snippet of that in cut 7, again, of his exchange with Senator Lindsey Graham on the question of regulating big tech.
Here's the question that all of us got to answer. What do we tell our constituents, given what's happened here, why we should let you self-regulate? What would you tell people in South Carolina that, given all the things we've just discovered here, it's a good idea for us to rely upon you to regulate your own business practices?
Well, Senator, my position is not that there should be no regulation. Okay. I think the Internet is increasingly
important. Do you embrace regulation?
I think the real question, as the Internet becomes more important in people's lives, is what is the right regulation, not whether there should be or not.
But you as a company welcome regulation?
I think if it's the right regulation, then yes.
Do you think the Europeans have it right?
I think that they get things right.
Have you ever submitted? That's true. So would you work with us in terms of what regulations you think are necessary in your industry?
Absolutely.
Okay. Would you submit to us some proposed regulations?
Yes, and I'll have my team follow up with you so that way we can have this discussion across the different categories where I think that this discussion needs to happen.
Look forward to it.
Should we regulate you? Would you welcome regulation? Well, if it's the right regulation, okay, will you help us write the right regulations? Literally, that's what we just saw in the exchange. Should we, the government, regulate you, and will you help us determine regulations that we should put into effect for social media companies? Milton Friedman in cut 3, last clip, and then we'll welcome our guest, warned about this kind of welcoming by tech companies of government regulators and benefactors.
Business in general has something of a suicidal instinct. It often proposes laws in its own self-interest, which destroy the underlying basis of the whole private enterprise system. I believe that is what has been happening recently in the computer industry. Silicon Valley is suicidal in calling government in to mediate in its disputes among some of the big companies in the area and Microsoft. The end result will be that an industry that up to now has been able to proceed at a marvelous pace with little or no government regulation. It has been a wonderful example of the efficiencies of a strictly free private market. That industry is now going to have government all over it. It's going to spend in legal fees over the next 10 or 20 years, money which society would benefit from much more if it were spent in the kind of research and development that has brought us the many miracles in the area of internet, in the area of home computers, industry computers, and all the rest.
That was 21 years ago. His words ring far truer today than they did even then. Let's talk a little bit more about the idea of regulating big tech and what it could mean, why they would like a seat at the table, and more with Matthew Feeney, who's director of the Project on Emerging Technologies at the Cato Institute, and he joins us now here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Matthew, thanks so much for joining us. I really appreciate your time today.
No, well, thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
So I want to get your reactions first to both the clip of Mark Zuckerberg saying, hey, if it's the right regulation, not only do we welcome it, but we'll help you write it, but also Milton Friedman in 1999 warning about big tech, like so many businesses often do, embracing government involvement in their affairs.
Right. I thought it was really interesting that you highlighted that clip because it really does showcase something that market liberals, libertarians have been saying for a while, which is that we should be wary of so-called regulatory capture, namely that there is a risk to regulations, and regulations can be weaponized by market incumbents. And in this case, Facebook's a good example, which is that it's not a surprise that companies in this kind of market position are hesitant to embrace regulations, but once they see the writing on the wall, then they'll oppose regulations up until the point that they can write them. And Facebook, Google, all the big names in Silicon Valley, they can hire more engineers and lawyers than God. And they will always be in an advantageous position when it comes to this kind of political environment, which is one where you have the right and the left coming together in an attempt to regulate an industry. And, looking at Milton Friedman, in that clip you showed just reveals how right he was, as he was about so much.
It's so interesting when you say right and left coming together, because while they may be united on the idea, increasingly so at least, that government should be more heavily involved in regulating big tech, the reasons behind it and what they would like to see done are different. For example, on the right, you have pushback saying, oh, President Trump should not be fact-checked by Twitter, and the government should require that they don't fact-check the President of the United States on a comment that he makes on Twitter. But then on the other hand, you have Democrats who will say, wait a second, we should require that Facebook and Twitter police content more actively to make sure that misinformation, however that's defined, is not presented. At least that's how I read the argument. So while they may be increasingly unified on the idea of let's regulate, the reasons for it and the ways they want to go about it seem to be different, Matthew.
That's right. I would also say that from usually the political left, but sometimes on the political right, you also have claims of monopoly. And I know that you and Professor Volok had a brief discussion about Section 230 and monopoly, so I don't want to retread material that your viewers have already seen, but I'll just mention that the political environment where you have complaints about a certain industry that are so different make a big piece of legislation hard to imagine. I don't know how they can square these holes. A piece of legislation that addresses the concerns of the Ted Cruzes and the Josh Hawleys on one hand, but then also the Elizabeth Warrens on the other, is hard to envision at this point. But unfortunately, we're in an election year, so actually it's advantageous for politicians of all stripes to look as if they're doing something about these problems associated with big tech. But my position is that these companies aren't monopolies, that they should be free to moderate their content as much as they want. And that's in large part because I want there to be a market where those who have a better idea than Facebook, those who have a better idea than YouTube and Twitter can actually build one. And I worry about the impacts of regulations that actually make competition harder.
Something that's fascinating to me, too, and then we'll dive into some more specifics of this discussion with you, Matthew Feeney, our guest from the Cato Institute, is that, look, both sides, so to speak, are talking about increasing regulation of Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, so on and so forth. But if you can't agree on the basis for the regulation, and you can't agree on what you should regulate, maybe that's a sign that you shouldn't get into the business of regulating it in the first place, in part because you're going to find a mess of different interests at play, different trajectories, different motives, different policies put in place that could be increasingly contradictory. I don't understand how anybody thinks that if you got two sides of the aisle that are arguing for different forms of regulation, and actually you still have a lot of people on the right, like myself, I consider myself a conservative, who are more libertarian on this and are not on board with the idea of increased regulation. If you've got so much division, the idea that the President of the United States, as we'll get into, should unilaterally take steps like what he introduced yesterday in his executive order, I think should be deeply concerning to people, because you can't even agree on where to go, much less what you should be doing and why.
Well, right. As a libertarian myself, I actually get worried by bipartisanship sometimes. Too much agreement on these kind of issues is sometimes concerning. I know that you and Professor Volok had a discussion about 230. I would just mention that when the Senate considered the last amendment to 230, which dealt with content associated with human trafficking, there were only 2 votes against it. John McCain didn't make it because he was too ill, but the only 2 votes in the Senate against it were Senator Wyden, a Democrat, who actually co-authored Section 230 when he was a member of the House, and Rand Paul, who may have been flexing some of his libertarian instincts. And I think that's that's a hint at that actually, if you can hook an amendment or a regulation to a law, in order to get bipartisan support, you just have to link it to something horrible like human trafficking. And at the moment, you have conversations about legislation called the Earn It Act, which is linked to images of child sexual abuse and exploitation, which of course is content no one wants to be associated with or to be portrayed as defending in any way, even though defenders of 230, of course, are not in that boat. But it's very difficult politically, oftentimes, to make a stand when that's the kind of conversation that's surrounding the issue.
Yeah, the nuance is lost all too often in politics, to be sure. I want to read a passage to you, Matthew Feeney, again, director of the Cato Institute's Project on Emerging Technologies, from a New York Post op-ed this week by Sohrab Amari, who is the Post op-ed editor. And he said this, quote, "Here's the deal. If I publish libelous claims in the Post, my victims can hold the Post liable in court. But Twitter is immune to such suits under the 1996 Communications Decency Act. Section 230 of the law, which you have been referencing, which we talked with Professor Eugene Volokh about in the last segment, provides that, quote, no provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as a publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider. But note," the author of this piece goes on, "the underlying assumption that online bulletin boards, and that's what Twitter is, a glorified bulletin board, don't act as publishers. But by policing conservatives and fact-checking, in quotes, the Republican president of the United States, Twitter is acting exactly like a publisher. So why should one class of publishers, such as the Post, be held liable, while another gets to escape liability merely because its editors are hard-left California geeks?" Now, obviously, I don't want you to so much address the legal standpoint on that, but the idea from a government policy standpoint, what do you make of his argument? We hear it from conservatives a lot, that this is what should be done as far as the treatment, or changed in terms of the mindset of treatment of social media companies, not just as platforms, but as publishers.
Right. When I hear criticism like this, I think it reveals an ignorance of where the current legal framework came from in the first place. Just imagine this thought experiment. Imagine that Twitter was the publisher of content uploaded by third parties, or the vast majority of it. There are hundreds of millions of tweets posted every single day. If Twitter was held legally liable for any tweet that was put up, you would see the end of Twitter. You would certainly see the end of President Trump's Twitter account, and you would certainly see the end of Twitter as we know it. The reason that we don't treat Twitter as a publisher in the way that people think of the New York Times as a publisher is because these are different kind of entities, and that's what Representatives Chris Cox and Ron Wyden actually understood in 1996 when they were drafting Section 230. I want to stress, though, something important here which gets lost in this debate is you'll often hear people saying there's a distinction here between publishers and platforms. And this is a made-up distinction that isn't in the law at all. In fact, publishers, as we traditionally understand them, are covered by Section 230. So, for example, the op-ed you just quoted, if there's libelous content in there, then the author and the publisher can certainly be sued. But if there's libelous content in the comment section, then that comment section is an interactive computer service under Section 230. So I think this distinction really actually muddles the water and makes the debate much more difficult. And I think that people who are angry about the way that Twitter and Facebook are moderating content should really appreciate that Section 230 didn't come out of thin air. And in fact, it was lawmakers who took a look at the field and understood that if the internet was treated in the way that the author of the op-ed suggests, there would be far less speech online, because you are in a situation now where you have hundreds of millions of tweets per day. You have something like 400 hours of content uploaded to YouTube every minute. There's no conceivable way that it would be responsible for a company in a world where they could be held liable for that just to let people upload it. So look, if you want to destroy the internet as we know it, if you want to get rid of social media and the exchange of ideas that we've come used to, then I feel like people should just say that. But the idea that Twitter would look anything like Twitter if it was treated like the publisher of the tweets that people tweet is silly.
What about, though, being consistent in application of the rules, because it does seem like more often than not it's conservatives that are the ones, at least from a political standpoint, that are being fact-checked or that find their accounts suspended or particular tweets removed and what have you. And so there's that argument, for example, from PragerU that you need to be more fair in your application. In that case, of course, that's on YouTube and blocking of certain content or making it more difficult to access particular content. But the idea is that you're not being consistent, you're not treating conservatives fairly, and therefore the government should potentially get involved in ensuring that there is fair application of the rules and that conservatives are not being unduly censored.
Right. So there's a lot to unpack there, but I'll start at the beginning, which is that even if the Silicon Valley companies were in some kind of concerted, organized campaign to take down conservative content, then they should be free to do so. These are private companies. They should be free to do that. Is there evidence they're doing this? Well, one, I would just return to what I said earlier, which is there's so much information being shared every hour, every minute on these platforms that you will, of course, be able to find inconsistencies with the content moderation rules. And that's not a surprise, but conservatives who are concerned about this should appreciate that people on the political left have also made their own complaints. The World Socialist website wrote a letter to Google complaining about Google's censorship of left-wing views and that Google was trying to make sure that people couldn't learn about socialism. You had complaints from activists about Black Lives Matter content. And if you think about the case like PragerU, Prager's concern was that something like 12% of his videos on YouTube were being put in restricted mode, and that this was evidence of some kind of anti-conservative bias, totally ignoring the fact that actually YouTube channels that are run by people like the Young Turks or The Daily Show have a far higher percentage of their videos put in this restricted mode, which I hardly think is evidence of anti-conservative bias. So I'll mention that I've written about claims of anti-conservative bias before on the Cato blog, on Medium, at a paper for George Mason University. I don't find the arguments convincing, but I'll just end with my libertarian point, which is even if it were true, even if Mark Zuckerberg woke up and said, you know what, anyone who's ever liked a Republican politician on Facebook, just delete their account, he should be free to do that. Your comment on who should be in the business of determining neutrality, I'd much rather private failure than public failure. I'd much rather Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook be bad at this than the FTC or the FCC be bad at it.
That's where I completely agree. Like, I think that there's enough to say that conservatives do face the brunt of, at least a little bit more of this sort of, shall we say, discrimination. But even if that's the case, your second argument about having government get involved as a result of that is not justified, is not supported, particularly because government is force. Government has the power of force, and once you get government involved, then it can manipulate things, it can provide direction, it can do all sorts of things that Facebook and Twitter as private companies can't do, because even though being in media, for example, as I am, it's kind of necessary to get involved in these platforms, it's not something that you are required to do. You don't have somebody at the point of a gun saying you must take this step, you must join Facebook or Twitter or else. However, if the federal government gets involved in certain ways, they do have the power of force to direct things in a way that Facebook and Twitter cannot. And that's dangerous.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And what this actually takes us, I think, nicely back to the question you asked at the beginning and the video clip of Mark Zuckerberg here, which is that these kind of regulations will help the companies that are in a position to engage in this kind of moderation, and we shouldn't ignore the fact that content moderation sounds easy to begin with, but it actually is very hard. So let's say that, look, Jimmy, you and I, we quit our jobs and we want to build a competitor to Facebook, say, and we've got some very friendly, very wealthy friends who are going to fund it. We might sit down and think, well, let's have a content moderation policy, and let's write it. And we meet in a room and we say, look, should we have a policy that bans images of nude children? And you and I might say, like, yes, obviously, this is a good rule. But then, as Facebook experienced, someone uploads the footage, the photo, of the aftermath of that napalm bombing in the Vietnam War, which includes an image of a naked young girl running towards the photographer. It's one of the most iconic images of the 20th century, and Facebook initially took it down because it violated the rule. But then they put it back up, and there's a question of, well, do we have a historical significance exception? There was a tweet that targeted Meghan McCain, the daughter of John McCain, at her father's funeral with a photoshopped gun, and there were debates about, is this a threat under the rules of Twitter? And the point is that we shouldn't pretend that these decisions are easy. In fact, there are ways in which the same content can be viewed as good or bad. Facebook, I think it was, had a policy whereby if you showed footage of someone being bullied at school and you were condemning the bullying, then you could keep the footage up. But if it was laughing about the bullying victim, then you took it down. This is very difficult. It's complicated. And we shouldn't expect perfection. We should expect that there will be failures sometimes. But as I said earlier, I'd rather Facebook fail than the FTC.
Two final questions for you, Matthew Feeney, again, our guest from the Cato Institute. The first one, I want to play cut 9. This is President Trump yesterday laying out one of the steps that his executive order is taking in terms of Section 230 and in terms of some of the regulatory powers he'd like to restructure.
Therefore, today I'm signing an executive order to protect and uphold the free speech and rights of the American people. Currently, social media giants like Twitter receive an unprecedented liability shield based on the theory that they're a neutral platform, which they are not an editor with a viewpoint. My executive order calls for new regulations under Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act to make it that social media companies that engage in censoring or any political conduct will not be able to keep their liability shield. That's a big deal. They have a shield. They can do what they want. They have a shield. They're not going to have that shield.
Removing the, as he puts it, liability shield. Real briefly, Matthew Feeney, what do you make of the specifics of the executive order that the president issued yesterday?
Given his comment there, it sounds like Donald Trump is advocating for the removal of his own Twitter feed. The fact is that if you remove this liability shield, you're going to have far less content. I would also say that President Trump is just factually incorrect when he says that this liability shield is contingent on some kind of neutrality. He's not the only one to spread this myth. Senator Cruz, in questions to Mark Zuckerberg, also expressed this, but I hope that viewers consider that this actually isn't true. In fact, Section 230 encourages content moderation and protects firms like Twitter from removing content that they consider to be offensive or lewd or bad for their business model, even if that is language or content that is protected by the First Amendment. There's a ton of content out there that is legal, but you might not want for your service. Pornography, images of people being beheaded, photos of animals being tortured to death. This is all protected by the First Amendment, but it's not all business friendly. It's not all the kind of content people building social media sites would like to see. And what I hope people appreciate is that conservatives, especially when they talk about this kind of move that the president made yesterday, are actually digging their own graves without realizing it. Social media, as we know it, has, I would argue, been a massive benefit to American conservatives. It's never been easier for people in the world, let alone just conservatives, to find each other and to organize. And absent Section 230, the internet's plunged into a world where social media as we know it does not exist. And I think that's not just bad for conservatives, but anyone with a viewpoint to share.
I'm coming up on a decade of conservative talk radio and recently started this web show in partnership with the Washington Examiner. There used to be something called the Fairness Doctrine, and that was the government making sure that there was an equal time requirement in place for content that was provided in the radio. When that was removed, that allowed for conservative talk radio to take off, and the internet really has provided tremendously more opportunities for conservatives, to your point, Matthew Feeney, to get the message out even more than ever before, get around the mainstream media, so on and so forth. And I do think that is an important perspective to keep in mind. Now, final question for you. There is this idea, whether we're talking about Facebook, Twitter, YouTube's parent company, Google, whatever, when it comes to online search engines and social media platforms and other aspects, even Amazon and what have you. There's discussion about treating these types of big tech companies as public utilities. What would that entail, and what do you make of that argument?
I'm against it, but I also think that depending on who you ask, this means something different. It would certainly mean that there would be far more of the kind of content that's objectionable out there. I think people oftentimes like to talk about telephone companies and these kind of analogies. Yes. But the point is, when I call you on the phone, the only parties to those calls are you and me, right? But the whole point of social media is that you're actually trying to get the message out to many, many other people. And actually, people are often on Facebook and Twitter because they want people they've never met or never seen to hear their message. And the problem is, if you treat it like a public utility, you're running into all kinds of different issues about the kind of speech that will or will not be allowed. And you run the risk, I think, of more people interacting with content they don't want because companies will be under much different kind of pressures. So it's similar to the arguments that I was discussing earlier, which is if you want more horrific but legal content out there, I don't see how you could limit that in a way that's family friendly, for example, while also trying to maintain that these are some kind of public utilities. I also just think that they're just clearly not. I don't know why this argument seems to never die, but the internet is much more than Silicon Valley, and there are, believe it or not, there are other places that people can go to spread their message. I understand why some people might be frustrated that they're not allowed into the most popular house party in town, but that doesn't entitle you to call the cops and demand that you be let in. The answer to this, I think, is for a market where people who want to build the kind of content moderation policies they can are free to. And my worry is that more regulation just makes market incumbents much, much stronger and harder to dethrone.
No, I think the government should allow me into that party, Matthew. I mean, the idea that I was excluded is just not fair. Good points today, Matthew Feeney of the Cato Institute and the director of the Project on Emerging Technologies. Really appreciate you joining us on this Free to Choose Friday edition of Jimmy at the Crossroads.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Once again, Matthew Feeney joining us from the Cato Institute. I think the fundamental point here is that, we've said it before, one of the comments that Milton Friedman, our sort of patron of Free to Choose Friday, was fond of saying, and that is, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. You can have all the good intentions in the world for why you want to regulate big tech, but think about all the unintended consequences of it. And by the way, you can't even find agreement from left and right, those who advocate greater regulation, on what they should regulate, what the approach is. So how the hell can you even accomplish that objective if both sides can't agree on what to regulate or not to regulate? Which, by the way, underscores one significant point. President Trump, with all due respect, should not unilaterally, by executive order, be making these kinds of decisions. They ought to be ferreted out by legislators who can debate it, who can hash it out, who can take the time and have these discussions as they've been having the past couple of years. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg testified in 2018 in April. So now we're 2 years removed from his testimony. This debate's been going on. Okay, it's taking time. That should be a good thing. We should not be rushing legislators to regulate, and we should not be rushing the President of the United States to unilaterally regulate via executive order when Americans of all sorts of different stripes cannot even agree on the terms of the regulation, whether or not it should happen, what the basis for that regulation should be. Are you simply promoting all sorts of different viewpoints to be expressed? Or do you think that you should regulate certain viewpoints being expressed to make sure that you're not getting misinformation spread by Russian agents or by American companies or by American presidents? Making sure that they don't spread misinformation that could influence elections or influence people's viewpoints. Look, I don't like that Facebook and Twitter have been taking down, or YouTube have been taking down videos and posts and censoring individuals for content they believe to be spreading misinformation about coronavirus or about mail-in ballots. I agree. President Trump, in my view, is wrong when it comes to a lot of the facts about mail-in ballots, at least on the whole. If you narrowly tailor it, as we've talked about on this show, to the president, say, complaining about rushing to mail-in ballots in 2020, and that could promote fraud, that could violate tenets of election integrity, I'm absolutely on board with that. That's right. But he's been painting broad brushes. But just because I disagree with the president's opinion and the factual basis he claims to be representing in expressing that opinion does not mean that YouTube or Facebook or, in this case, Twitter should be noting, hey, this is factually wrong. Does not mean that Facebook or Twitter or YouTube should take down certain things that the President of the United States says or put them behind a block that says, oh, anybody else who said this, they would be completely removed, but the President of the United States gets an exemption because he's the President, so we're just going to put up this wall. But just because I disagree with Facebook or Twitter or YouTube or Google taking those sorts of steps, which, who knows, I may find myself the victim of something like that in the future, doesn't mean that the government should get involved or that government involvement is the right way to do it. Keep in mind, and we talked about this with Dave Rubin last week on the show, keep in mind that there are two reasons why a Facebook or a Twitter would embrace the right regulation. Number one, that's because that outlet would like to pawn off the responsibility of determining what should or should not be allowed speech-wise on the government. Oh, no, the government said we have to allow that, or the government said we can't allow that, or the government said we must put this fact check there or not put this fact check there. They could just have the weight lifted off of their shoulders as companies if the federal government takes particular steps that usurp that responsibility from the social media giants. Then they have some sort of a new kind of shield, which is the government. That's number one. Number two, this is the reason we talked about in the video earlier. Number two is that these big tech companies can push out new competitors that might be wanting to get into the mix because they put regulatory restrictions in there that are high bars for new private companies to come up with or to meet. So, for example, Mark Zuckerberg in 2004, along with some friends, created Facebook. Now Facebook is one of the most massive, significant, influential web companies in the world, created 16 years ago by a bunch of college kids at Harvard. What about the next Mark Zuckerberg? The next person who wants to go create a new company that will do something like Facebook, like Twitter, might be better than either of those, heck, even better than both of them combined. But there are regulations in place by the government that make it difficult, if not impossible, for that new company to get into the mix and compete with Facebook and Twitter. Big companies like pushing out competition by using regulation. So this is not a cut and dry, simple thing. You shouldn't just have the President of the United States unilaterally making decisions like this. And Congress definitely should not rush to judgment. A more hands-off approach with maybe some transparency requirements, like we talked about with Professor Eugene Volokh earlier in the show, that may be appropriate. But going all out and making all sorts of regulatory restrictions and putting in these requirements or saying you have to allow this or you can't allow that, that is a recipe for disaster and a recipe for the loss of individual liberty more and more in America than anything Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Google, Amazon could ever do. That is it for us today. I'm Jimmy Sengenberger. Although I will say that we've got Basil Boz. We're going to do a special report in about 20 minutes. We're going to come back live for a special report with Basil Boz, who is a former CIA officer, who's got some interesting insights on what's happening in Minnesota and Minneapolis with these riots. You do not want to miss that. We'll be back on a little over 20 minutes from now with a special report. But for our full edition of Jimmy at the Crossroads, that is it for us today. I am Jimmy Sengenberger. Thanks so much for joining us, being a part of the program. Tune in 710 KNUS tomorrow night, 5 to 8 p.m. on Denver Radio. My thanks to our guests and Nathan Matoush, producer extraordinaire, and to our partners at the Washington Examiner. Please subscribe, youtube.com/Jimmy at the Crossroads, and may God bless America.